In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a turn pen. And this particular pen is called a slimline style. It's fairly thin, easy to hold in the hand, and it's actually one of my favorites. And it's one of the most simple, basic pens to make. And in this video, I'm going to show how to do all the wood preparation, the turning, the final assembly, everything. So stick around. Let's make a pen. Okay, let's talk about the tools and anything else that we're going to need to make our pen. For starters, we're going to have to mark our pen blank. This is going to be our pen blank, and this particular one is black walnut. Pen blanks are typically 3/4 by 3/4 by roughly 5 inches in length, and you can buy them pre-cut like this, or you can cut them yourself out of a board. I find that it's not really difference in price if I buy them pre-cut versus cutting them myself. And of course, I can't just buy a piece like this at the lumber store. I'd have to buy a full board, so sometimes it just makes more sense to buy the pre-cut blanks. For marking, I'm going to use a small square. This is just a 6-inch square. This is plenty big. Mechanical pencil or any kind of pencil with a sharp point. The kit. This is a slimline kit. There's all kinds of pen kits, but slimline tend to be a beginner's pen. It's easy to get started. It's what I got started with doing, and I was able to pick it up pretty quick. So we've got a kit here. I get them off of Amazon, which is actually the wood turning store, is the ones that are actually distributing it through Amazon. And then Penn State Industries is another great place to get kits from. We talked about the blank. For drilling the blank, we're going to need a 7mm pen blank, or pen kit, or I'm sorry, pen drill bit. This is a brad point bit. If you can buy just a regular 7mm bit, that's fine. A lot of times they are labeled as a pen drilling or pen blank drilling bit. I don't see any difference between the two. So that's the bit that we'll need. And then we'll also need what's called an end reamer. And this does two different things. This just fits inside the brass tube that we're going to glue inside the blank. And what this does is it not only cleans out that brass tube as you drill this through, it's going to clear out any kind of glue or anything that got in there, but then also this little end mill cutter here is going to actually square up the face of each side of the blank, and you'll see how we do that when we go to the drill press to do that part of it. We'll have to cut this blank basically in half is what we're going to do, and we'll need to drill it out. And you can do it one of two ways. You can either drill it on a drill press using some kind of jig or vise of sort to hold it square. And that's how I started off doing this. I've actually started drilling this with my lathe itself, and what I do is I use this chuck with these jaws, and the blank will actually fit down in those jaws. I gotta open it up a little bit further, but they would fit down in there. And then I would actually put my 7mm bit using my tailstock in this Jacob's chuck, and you would actually just use this, and then we're gonna run this bit through the blank as the lathe is turning the blank, and I'll show you how we're going to do that. And that will give us a nice accurate center drill hole right through the middle of the blank. The other way is to, after you've cut the blank, you mark your center line, and then you would drill it on the drill press. And you can do it either way. I just find that the lathe is a lot more accurate and sometimes faster. Okay, also for when we get to the turning process, we're going to have to use something called bushings and a mandrel. The mandrel right here is it's a tapered M2 taper, and this will fit in the live drive side, of the lathe, and we'll use these bushings, these little bushings here. And what we'll do is put one on, the blank goes on, and then the second bushing goes on, and then you can either use this little knurled nut to tighten it down, or what I prefer to use is something called a mandrel saver. And this is essentially a live center that goes into your tailstock, and the tailstock will come up, and you'll tighten your tailstock up against everything, and it'll hold everything in place. And the beauty of this is you don't have a bunch of stress on the tip of this mandrel. Normally you'd have something like this center in your tailstock, and on the end here there's a little concave, and it's there so you can bring your center up and press against it. But sometimes if you put too much pressure, you can actually bend this shaft here, and then it's ruined. Basically, you have to replace it. So instead of using that method, I prefer to use the mandrel saver, and that's how we're going to turn this. And some people like to turn both pieces of the blank at the same time. I find sometimes I have to put a lot of pressure to get them on there to keep them from spinning, and I spend more time messing around with that. So I actually have gotten to the point where I just turn a single blank at a time, and it doesn't really take me any longer than it would have if I had both of them on there, because it only takes me about 30 seconds to swap out the one blank for the other one, so I can turn it. So, all right, let's go ahead and go look at what we got to do to prep our pen blank. Okay, in your pen kit, if it's a slimline kit, well, actually just about every pen kit comes this way, but if it's a standard kit that uses two sections or two pieces, you're going to find two brass tubes in there, just like these here. And for a slimline kit, they're 7mm, and they're the same length. They're the exact same length, so we don't have to worry about getting one in the wrong place or whatever. Okay, in order to mark this blank out, it's fairly simple. Since we know both these tubes are the same, we're just going to use the one. And to mark this out, what I like to do is set it on the blank, and I give myself just a little extra on this end. So there's a little extra wood protruding, and I have actually inset the tube just a little bit. And once I'm happy with the location, I'm going to mark. But I'm not going to mark right at the end of the tube. I'm going to come out about 1/16 or so, and I'm going to mark a little mark just like that. And now I'm going to take it and I'm going to set it about the same distance away from the line as I did on this side. So I want to put it on this side about that same distance. So I'm going to end up with roughly a little more than 1/16 of an inch gap between where the tubes were laying. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to give myself a little gap, and I'm going to mark just like that. And then just take the square and strike a line across the blank where you made those two marks. Just like that. And now we're ready to cut this. Okay, we're at the bandsaw here, and we're just going to make these two straight cuts. It's very simple, just two straight cuts. You could cut this on a chop saw or a table saw with a sled or something along that. You could hand saw it with if you wanted with something like a dovetail saw. The thing is, though, you want to be careful because your saw kerf has a lot to do with how accurate this is going to be. And if you remember back on the bench, we marked these lines and we gave ourselves about 1/16 of an inch gap, give or take, between. If we were to use something like a standard saw blade, like a table saw blade or a chop saw blade, we'd lose about 1/8. We'd actually lose about 1/8 by doing that, and at that point we'd probably actually have not enough wood. So if you decide to use that kind of saw, you're going to need to make sure to accommodate for that and give yourself more of a gap in between. With my bandsaw, I have a very, very thin blade here, so as I cut down right down the middle of the line, it's going to take a very, very thin kerf, and it's going to take very little wood away, and that's why I like to use the bandsaw for doing this. But I could also use something like like my dovetail saw, which has a fairly thin blade, but it's still not as thin as the bandsaw. So let's go ahead and cut this. Let's go ahead and cut these two lines. There we go. We have our two blanks cut and ready to go. And because our saw kerf was very thin, we probably only lost maybe about 1/32 of material in between. And of course, we end up with a little scrap piece at the end. Okay, now we need to do a process that I normally don't have to do anymore because of the way I drill my blanks. Since I drill my blanks on the lathe using a chuck and the tail center, or the tail stock, it essentially self-aligns or self-centers the bit. But if you're going to drill these on a drill press or even with a hand drill, I don't recommend a hand drill, because a hand drill can wander on you, and you have a hard time getting the bit to go right down through the mill. So by using the drill, again, by using the lathe, it's self-centering, and I really don't have to do this process, but I'm going to show this on the video, so that way if you go to do it by the drill press, you'll have done this. So I have this marking guide, and this thing's great. It's got a 90-degree fins right here, and if I put that on the blank and butt the blank up against that corner, now the 90-degree fins are on the bottom side of this. It's on the bottom side, and if I do that, now I can run a pen, or a pencil I mean, right there, and turn it and do it again, and by doing that I've now marked the center. Now this blank, it doesn't appear to be perfectly square, so the mark is actually a little off center, but as far as these two corners are concerned, it registers off of two faces, and then these two faces, depending on how you have the marking gauge sitting on it. But we now know effectively a good center point to drill at. And if we were doing this on the drill press, we would drill right at that center point there. And I would do that on both pieces, because we have to drill both of these individually. And there we go, there's the other one. So, okay, I'm not going to show how to drill this on a drill press, but the next step is we'll go to the lathe and we'll put these on the lathe and drill them. Okay, we're over here at the lathe now, and we're going to drill out our blanks. So remember, we've got to drill those 7mm holes with that 7mm bit. So I'm going to use my Barracuda chuck with these jaws, and these jaws aren't necessarily meant for drilling a blank like this, but because they're small and can contact all four sides of the blank, this actually works really, really well. So we're going to put this chuck on the lathe, and I've got my tailstock here, and I've got this chuck, sometimes called Jacob's chuck. It's a keyless chuck, so I don't actually have to use a key to put the bit in. And I'm going to run my tailstock out, and this is all by friction pressure, so I tend to just kind of give it a little whack and it stays in place. And then we're going to put our bit in, get that tight, and then on the chuck, I'm going to open this up. Got our first blank. And it doesn't have to be super tight, just snug, just enough so it's not going to come out of there while we're trying to do this drilling. Now I tend to drill this at a fairly, I don't know, about medium speed, so probably around 1,000 RPM or so. That's really plenty to drill this. Now I'm going to run this up and just quickly check this. I just want to look and see how close is this to being accurate. And it's fairly accurate. Now one of the tricks I found is to tighten this spindle down. Use the spindle lock, because when it's not locked, this will tend to shake around in here a little bit. And I'm going to do something probably a little unorthodox. Instead of running the spindle out with the handle, I'm going to actually just push this slowly into the blank and then pull it back out when it's done. And the reason I do that is the travel on my spindle all the way out will only make it about 2/3 of the way, and then I would have to move it and do that again. So it's actually easier for me to just slowly, and really the tailstock is great because it acts as a carriage to slowly just keep this in line, keep it nice and straight, and drill the blank. So let's go ahead and drill this first one. Bring our speed down, and now we're just going to start just slowly plunging. Gonna back it out. Get some of those chips out of there. And we're through. Okay, looks pretty good. And there you can see that's our 7mm hole on the first blank. Now we'll just chuck up the second blank and do the exact same thing. And there we go. There's our second blank. There's our first blank. And they're ready to go. Now we'll take them back over to the bench and put our brass tubes in. Alright, now we're ready to glue our tubes in. And you'll find usually when these come out of the kit, they're usually fairly bright and not tarnished. Sometimes actually the brightness and smoothness works against you because the glue doesn't want to adhere as well. And we're going to be using some super glue. This particular glue just happens to be Satellite City Hot Stuff Super T. And I like to use the gel, which is this is like a medium, what they call a medium style, and it's kind of a gel. It seems like thin is like water; it'll run all over the place, but the gel will kind of stick to the tube as you're trying to work with it. So part of the shininess, like I said, will work against you. So I use a piece of sandpaper. Doesn't really matter what grit. This happens to be 400 grit. This is pretty high, but I'm going to use this to just knock some of that sheen off. And it roughs up the surface, and it's going to help that CA adhere a little bit better. And when I'm done, I just run my fingers over it to get any of that dust off. And now it's still got some sheen to it, but now it has a little bit of a roughed up surface. I'm going to do that to both pieces, or both sections of tubing. Everyone has a different philosophy on how to sand these. Some people say sand it lengthwise. Some people say go across it like this, so that way you have the score marks going this way. I haven't found either ways worked all that differently. So I find it, if I'm just sanding these by hand, it's easier to just do it this way and just go to lengthwise. When I first got started, I went as far as to put the tubes on the lathe and actually turn them on the lathe and put the sandpaper to it. And again, it didn't really appear to make all that much difference of the way that I did it. So I just do it by hand. And again, just run my fingers over it to get any dust off of it, keep it nice and clean. So there we go. Now we got our two tubes prepped up, ready to go. And our blanks are drilled out, and we're ready to put this in. So I like to have a what I call like a glue waste block, whatever you want to call it. This is just something that I can use to push the tube in all the way, and the excess glue will go on this and not on my bench. So when I go put this in, I'll tend to go a little heavier down towards the end, and then go lightly along the tube here, because as you push it into the blank, it's going to self-distribute the glue. Now as you go in, you want to twist and push at the same time, and by doing that, it's going to distribute the glue evenly around the tube. Now at the end there, I just took it and pressed it down, and when you do that, you'll see that the tube is fairly flush with the end. And remember, we made this blank a little long, so I hope you can see that there, that the tube seems to be a little recessed on the other end, but that's okay. That's what we want. These tubes are actually cut a little long at the factory, so they intend for this to get trimmed down a little bit, and you'll see that when we go to do the squaring up the ends with the reamer. You'll see how that is going, or the end mill, you'll see how that's going to actually trim the tubes a little bit. So there's our first one. Now there's no glue on the bottom here coming out, so I'm safe to just set it on my bench and let it dry. Now we'll do the other one. Remember, you can go a little heavier at the bottom, but go light around these sides or up towards the topper end, because as you push this down and rotate, that glue is going to self-distribute. and not only will self-distribute, but it'll try to push some of that glue towards the edge, because it's like it's scraping the glue off of the tube, because the hole is a 7mm hole and there's a 7mm tube, so there's not a whole lot of room in there. That's why twisting tends to help distribute the glue a little bit better, and you'll get better adhesion. So there we go. That end is flush, just like the other one was. This one's recessed. You can see it's a little recessed in there. Now we'll set these aside and let them dry for about an hour. And then we'll come back and do the rest of our blank prep. And then we'll be ready to go to the lathe. Okay, now we need to square up the ends of these blanks, and we'll also at the same time the end mill cutter here that I've already put in the drill is going to not only square the ends up, but it's also going to trim the very ends of these brass tubes. It's going to trim them so that they're nice and smooth and clean, and it basically deburrs them at the same time. So I've got a real basic setup here, drill press. I use a little block underneath, or just a scrap piece of wood, a sacrificial piece of wood, so that I don't drill down into my plate, as well as I don't want to damage the end of the cutter. This is one of the larger cutters here for a larger pen, and you can see how it's kind of a scoop cut. It's almost like a spoon bit in a way, and I'm using the 7mm. That's the one I already have checked up. So to do this, I typically start the blank up on a little bit, so that way it doesn't catch. If you try to start with the bit out and start the drill up and then try to plunge, a lot of times the bit will catch the edge, and it will actually bend the tube, and it will basically ruin it. So I find that if I start with it up where it's inserted already and turn the drill on, that it's a lot easier to manage it this way. And as long as you keep your fingers on the blank out of the way, there's no harm here. So I'm going to go ahead and square this one up, and then we'll do the other one. Okay, real quick, I'll show you. That's squared up, and you can tell that the brass is nice and shiny. So you can tell that it's been milled all the way around by that end mill cutter. Now we'll do the other end. Remember, the other end's a little more recessed, so we've got to take a little more material off to get down to the tube. Okay, same thing. Now that we've squared it up, and don't worry about this lip or this edge around here. That's going to come off when we go to do this on the lathe. When we go to turn these pieces on the lathe, they'll come right off, and it'll be like it was never there. So let me do the other one real quick, and then we'll go over to the lathe. There we go. Squared up and ready for the lathe. Okay, now the time we've all been waiting for. We're going to go ahead and turn our blanks down. Now, you might remember at the beginning of the video I told you about these bushings. And these specific bushings, all the bushings are specific to the type of pen you're making. And this happens to be a slimline pen bushing set. You typically get 3 in a set if it's something like this, where you can have 1 at each end and 1 in the middle if you're turning both blanks at the same time. But if you remember at the beginning, I stated that sometimes I have a lot of hard time with the blank staying still or keep it from spinning, and I find it's easier to just turn them individually, so I only use 2 of my bushings, so technically I have a spare. Alright, so we're going to slide the first bushing on, and I have the shaft of the mandrel adjusted so that I really only have enough sticking out that I really need. So I put the first bushing on. Our blank is going to go on. A second bushing. And then we're going to bring up that mandrel saver tail center. And first thing I'm going to do is lock my tailstock so that it cannot slide back and forth now. And then I'm going to run this up till it just touches. And then I'm going to give it about a quarter turn for some pressure. And then I'm going to lock the tailstock. I'm going to lock that down so that it can't vibrate back. So now you can see that we have our blank locked in place, ready to start turning. Now, depending on the type of pen I'm making, it would depend on the type of tool I use, but for this particular pen, I like to just use the roughing. You can use a roughing gouge, but in my case, I have all carbide tools, and this is a rougher or roughing carbide bit. It's straight, or cutting tool, it's straight, and that's really useful when you're doing something like this where both ends are going to be the exact same diameter. I want something that I can just evenly cut across all the way and cut it down to the point where I don't have to do a whole lot of sanding other than to just take out some of the tool marks and clean it up. So let's go ahead and true this blank up. Okay, we have our blank turned down to a round shape now. I've knocked all those corners off. Now you'll notice that there were several times that the blank stopped spinning. That was basically the gouge or the rougher catching. And remember, when you're turning something that's just clamped into place with friction and pressure, there's always the tendency for something to come slightly loose or not be tight enough and cause that. It's unlike turning like when you have something in a chuck, or if it's using like a spur center where there's something to really bite into the material. In this case, we're just using pressure. It's just the pressure of the tailstock being pressed against the side of the wood and then into the live spindle. And so there's a tendency for it to come loose like that, or really not even come loose. It just spins, but the pressure's still there. And sometimes you can just add a little more pressure with the tailstock, just not too much because you don't want to bow this thing out, but just a little more pressure is all it'll take. So let's continue to turn this down. Okay, got this turned down pretty close to our final diameter, but one thing to pay attention to is that depending on the species of wood that you're turning, some have very straight grain and they have the tendency to split. And that's the case here with this black walnut. Black walnut tends to have a fairly straight grain, which lends itself to being split very easily and very straight, which is great in some cases, but in our case, we don't want that. That property works against us. So we have to be really careful. And as I get down to this size, I start taking lighter cuts. I also will start from the end and come in, and then start from this end and come in, because the more I try to go all the way across and then end on the end, there's a more tendency to catch the edge and actually crack this piece, and it'll come right off. It'll come right off like in two pieces. So I tend to stay starting from the end, coming in, starting from this end, coming in, and refine the piece down to its almost final diameter. So let's go ahead and keep doing that. Okay, we've got this down basically to where it's just a hair larger than the bushings. And the key here is that we're going to want to turn this down so that the diameter of the wood is the same outer diameter of these bushings. And that will ensure that we have the proper diameter for the piece for the pen. And because these bushings are the same size as the pen parts. And when we press those into place, we'll have a nice smooth transition from the wood to the part of the pen. So let me pull this back. Okay, now we're going to do some sanding. And I start with a really rough, this is 80 grit. I start with this, and I'm going to use this to basically bring the wood down to its almost final dimension. Very, very, very close to the bushings. And this will get a majority, and this is also a little bit safer than trying to bring it all the way down with the tool. The tool, again, we just run the risk of always catching and breaking this off, so the sandpaper will help us try to prevent that. I also use a set of three sanding sponges that I like to use. These are 3M, and they don't actually give it a grit number. They just say this is heavy, medium, and then I have an extra fine here. And these will be all we'll need to actually finish sanding this down. So let's go ahead and start with this sandpaper, and I also am going to back the speed back down to about 1,000 RPM or so. I don't want it going quite as fast. I'll periodically test by touching with my fingers to see if it's transitioning. And this side feels pretty good. This one needs just a little bit more. Okay. This is good. This looks really good. It's down to the right dimension. It's good and smooth, and it looks right. And as I work through those progressions, I just keep checking it to make sure I'm not dishing this out or hollowing this out in any way, because I don't want the center to be thinner than the outsides. I want it to be good and uniform all the way across. So this looks pretty good. Some turners might see this as cheating, the way I use the sandpaper to come all the way down to the final dimension, but I've had enough of these break off on me that I find the sanding gives me a much better chance of actually completing the piece without it coming apart, and then I have to start all over again, and then I've wasted that wood and that brass tube. So I find that the sanding for the last stage to get it down to its final dimensions is really the way to go. Okay, now we need to do some finish, and there's a million things you can do for finishes. There's all kinds of polishes and all kinds of other things. One of my favorite things is to just use a very light coat of beeswax, and that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do on this one. So I keep these little blocks of beeswax for this very reason, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start back up at that same speed, about 1,000, 1,200 RPM, and then I'm going to just do a quick swipe, just one quick swipe along, and it will distribute, and then we'll come back with a towel, and we'll use some friction, and we'll go back 2 to 3 times, and it will polish it up real nice. There we go, one time. Come back with a towel. Go 1, 2, 3. And there we go. And that's it for the finish. It's a nice beeswax finish. It's smooth and feels good to the finger. And we're done with this one. So we'll just turn the other one the exact same way. Okay, to take this off, we're just going to do everything in backwards, or reverse. We're going to bring the mandrel saver back, take the pressure off, release the tailstock, slide it back, pull off the bushing, pull off the pin section, and there we have it. There's our pin section ready to go. So now we got to just turn the other one. All right. That's number 2. Okay, now the time we've all been waiting for. Put this thing together and complete it. Okay, I have a pen press here. This is the press that I've been using to make all my pens. This thing is the best $35 that I ever spent as far as making pens. This thing makes it so much easier, precision, and it's really worth it. So if you're getting into pens, making all kinds of different pens, this thing right here is worth every penny. It's worth its weight in gold as far as I'm concerned. Here's how I got started doing it though. I took standard spring clamp, or not spring clamp, but a quick clamp, and I glued 2 hardwood, I believe these are poplar pads, because the rubber, whenever you try to press a pen together with the rubber would just give too much. So I added these pads in order to put the pen together. And I took this nylon spacer, it's just a nylon spacer with a hole in it, and I would use it to hold the tip of the pen against this, and it was a little cumbersome sometimes. I mean, I made it work, but it's not the best way to do it. I still have it as a backup, but ever since I bought this, I haven't touched this. In fact, this has been sitting on my bench for months now, like this. So anyways, I'm going to set that aside. We're going to use the pen press for this to show how easy it is. Okay, one of the nice things about this press is that it's got these flip in, flip out steps, and that allows this to slide back and stop, so it adjusts for the different stages of putting the pen. We can't put this together in one shot. We have to do it in stages, and here are the parts laid out for the pen. And basically there's some basic parts that are pretty much involved in every pen kit. For any moving pen kit that has a retractable point or tip. You've got the tip or point, this cone piece here. You've got the transmission. The transmission goes between the 2 sections, and that's what pushes this pen insert in and out. There's a decorative ring that goes in between the 2, and then there's a clip and a little top cap that's part of that clip. They go together as well. So we're going to start by putting the tip of the pen on. And all you do is, there's a hole in the end here that holds this tip. So I get that in there, and then I'm just going to gently, slowly press these together, just like that. Okay? And then the next step, while I have these already set the way it is, I can go ahead and do the clip with the top section. And I'm going to do the same thing. On this press, this is plastic. It's a nylon plastic, and it won't mar or damage any of the finishes on your parts, on your pen parts. So it's always a good idea to put those parts towards that end and have this end striking against the section of the pen section. Okay, there's the clip in the top. Now the transmission, we're going to have to take out a couple more spaces so we can scoot this back a little more. We got the transmission needs to go in, and you'll see on this transmission there is a little groove. Now that groove in general is where you want to press this into, because this thing will keep going all the way in as long as you keep pushing. I find that usually is about the right place, but I start by pressing it in just before I get to that, and I test it first. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to put this in here just before we get to that groove. And now, take this pin insert, and you can see the tip, and if I back it out, if I look in the end, I want to make sure that that's not protruding at all. In fact, I want to run my finger across and make sure there's no ink on my finger, and that will tell me that it's protruded enough. And I'm happy with that, so I'm not going to press this transmission in any further. And then all it's left to do is to take our little decorative ring. This slides over the transmission, just like that. And then the last part is the top of the pen, and it's just going to slide on just like that. And there's our completed pen. Now, it's worth noting that in some projects, the grain is pronounced enough that you'd like to see that grain lined up. And in that case, I would have taken very close attention to make sure that I put the grain in alignment. In some cases, you can actually mark them prior to turning, and that way you can keep track of which way is oriented. And for black walnut, I don't think the grain, this particular grain is not really really well pronounced. So I just put it together as is, and it still looks pretty good. So that's it. That's all there is to making a pen on the lathe. There are some steps involved and a little bit of prep work and everything, but I hope you've seen in this video that it's not hard and you can pick up the skill pretty fast. I want to thank you for watching, and please, if you like the video, please like down below. Please subscribe to my channel if you're new to my channel, and if you are a subscriber, thank you so much for watching. And I just want to say that I come up with certain methods that seem to work for me for making pens. They may not be traditional or whatever, and I'm by no means a professional pen maker. One channel that I would, well, actually a couple of channels that I would suggest, and I'll put links to the bottom. RJB Woodturner, that's a great channel for watching pens, how pens are made, and seeing different techniques there. And also Chad Schimmel's channel. I'll put a link to his channel as well. He's an outstanding pen maker as well, and those guys are the real true pros. Watch what they're doing, and you'll pick up more tips and tricks from those guys. Those guys are really, really good. But I just wanted to give my take on making a pen and showing how I did this. I actually had a friend ask me how this was made, and I told her that I would just make a video. It'd be a lot easier to just show her that way. So this is also a video by request, I guess. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.